Welcome back, DIVEBOMB IndyCar Podcast. It's a new season, but it's exactly the same. Álex Palou, the Conquistador of concrete, reigns supreme once again as he wins the opening round of the 2025 season on the streets of St. Petersburg. And after 6 months, we've been building up to this moment. We finally have a race to review. I'm Dan Jones, joined as always by Archie O'Reilly. A bit of a slow burner, that one I think we'll agree. It took a while for the race to get going, but the last 10 laps were pretty good, and we ended up with a bit of jeopardy towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, it's just great to have IndyCar back, isn't it? The off-season is so long, and I mean, it was good to see a big attendance in St. Pete and reports of a very big attendance there, and I think a lot of positivity online as well in response to the weekend. I know the race has kind of split opinion, as you said, Dan, and we'll come on to the slight downturn in overtaking compared to previous years, but it's quite nice. It's quite a nice thing that IndyCar has, that you can have a race that's regarded as being subpar, yet you still won't know who's going to win the race until the final 5 laps and the closing laps, and you still have such a crazy strategy game going on, and that's what we love about it. And it really did end with a bit of a flourish, as much as maybe traffic influenced that, but load of storylines to get into, some underdogs performing, and ultimately the champion starting his quest for the three-peat with a win. And I believe he's the first reigning champion since Dario Franchitti in 2011 to win the season opener. And at that point, he was also going for the three-peat in the number 10 car. And it was a promising start for Fox's coverage as well. So, yeah, delighted to finally be digging into a race again.
So if you're new to the podcast and haven't ever listened to a race review before, first of all, welcome. We hope you stay along for the journey. As always, we've got a lot to cover, but as we sort of do, we recap the main storylines, your Palous, your Dixons, the key figures of the weekend. We'll review some other stories. We'll review sort of the unsung heroes of the weekend, because they don't get enough attention in other podcasts, but we do give them the attention they deserve. We'll end off running through the running order and going through some little other awards for the weekend before we end off with our predictions, as we do for every single race review, because we love predictions on this podcast. We don't know why, because they have hardly ever found out any good at all, but we're still going with them, believe it or not. And the predicted tournaments are back this year for returning listeners of the podcast. But there's no better place to start than Álex Palou. St. Petersburg has never really been his best track before that. He got second in 2022. Chasing Scott McLaughlin, but it's always been a bit of a difficult one for Álex Palou as St. Petersburg. And this one was very much a strategy one. Very much a tyre combination, a bit of blacks, bit of greens, or the reds, or whatever you want to call them. And Palou, right strategy, right time, and he's the right man to execute it.
Yeah, it kind of feels like a performance we've become very used to from Álex Palou, as in, but I mean, he started down in 8th, which I guess from his standards is a slightly disappointing qualifying. But, he was kind of there in the ballpark, there or thereabouts in the early part of the race, but you didn't see much of him particularly. But then it comes to that final round of pit stops and he's in position to pounce. And it's something that we've spoken about so much and has made so much of Palou, is just that the precision and the ability to execute at the time when it really matters most. And it was a frustrating kind of end to the race for him. Those, 10 laps with sort of within the last 15 laps, he was stuck behind the back marker of Stingray Rob. But he just stays so calm. He stays so composed, and really delivers when it matters. And I think it's credit to kind of his patience as a driver as well. He doesn't force things early on, and he certainly didn't force things to get past Rob. And even though with Joseph Newgarden kind of chasing him down late on, he seems unflappable. And I think just like that calm and that composure in his execution is so impressive. And it continues to be something so impressive every time we see Álex Palou on track, really. And
look, it was a mix of strategy. He was on the right strategy. That was the most important thing in the end of the day, which we'll get onto later. Really hurt Scott McLaughlin, for example. And once O'Ward and Herta was out of the mix, it really was the ball in Palou's court. He just looks always comfortable at the front, doesn't he? He cycles his way to the front, very Dixon-esque of years previous. Cycles his way to the front, gets to the front, and there's never really any doubt of Álex Palou, is there? He is the Conquistador of concrete, is going to be the term we use a lot this episode. The professional precision. He's got too many nicknames now, does Álex Palou. But I mean, maybe he deserves it. He's a 3-time IndyCar champion after all, gunning for a 4th, and in perfect way to start it. And he goes into a streak of races he's really been strong at. Thermal Club obviously won last year. Long Beach admittedly hasn't been his best, but you go to somewhere like Indianapolis Road Course, he's always very strong at. Barber, he's always very strong at. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's over before it's over. And it is only round one, and I can't get ahead of myself. But, I mean, already the challenge looks tough.
Yeah, I mean, immediately coming into the season, I know a lot of people were saying this has got to be the year where maybe he takes a little bit of a backward step. But still, the only season we've seen in his 4 seasons with Ganassi so far where he has taken that backward step and hasn't won the championship was the year where obviously he had the whole off-track debacle with the McLaren contract and was going to leave Ganassi and didn't leave Ganassi. I think when he's got his mind focused, as it very much is and very much seems, he just seems more and more unstoppable. And yeah, as you say, he's got a great run of tracks coming up. We'll let Álex Palou do the talking, though. We caught up with him in the press conference after the race, asked him a bit about kind of what goes through his head when you've got that frustration of being stuck behind a car that is at the tail end of the lead lap, and also asked him, whether he believes there should be a rule similar to F1, like a blue flag rule, that means cars on that tail end of the lead lap do need to get out of the way of the leaders. So here is Álex Palou. You obviously got stuck behind Stingray for a little while. So just while you're in the cockpit and you are trying to pass a car at the end of the lead lap, what is kind of going through your head, and how do you manage, I guess, the frustration of trying to get past?
Similar to when you're in a highway and there's somebody that is driving at like 40 miles an hour on the left and wouldn't move. And then you pass him and he's like trying to go faster than before and he passes you again. And it's that kind of frustration, especially when he is able to use the OT and you as the leader, you don't want to burn 50 seconds of OT to pass a lap car, but he can do that to try and stay in front of you, especially if he's from another engine manufacturer. So it's a shame, but honestly, I know that's the rules, and there's been some races where that was beneficial to me, like to be second and to have the first one trap in traffic. This time I was the one that started losing my gap to Newgarden. I think it went from 5 seconds down to like 0.9, so we lost a bunch of track time, but at least we didn't lose any track position.
And kind of just to follow up on that, obviously you say that is the rule. Do you believe, and I know this has been a talking point for a while, that there should be a blue flag rule like you get in F1, for instance?
No, I don't. I wouldn't like the blue flag. I mean, yes, today I would have said, yeah, blue flag, please get this car out of the way. But there's many times where I'm last as well and I don't want to get lapped. So I like the blue flag rule. Maybe I would modify the OT rule because that would be, I would say more fair, because that way you don't allow the car in front of you to burn, as I said, 50 seconds of OT. Like I think Stingray went from 70 seconds of OT down to 0 in like 10 laps. So yeah, as the leader, you cannot burn all that OT because you might need it in case there's restarts or Newgarden attacking you. So yeah, I would modify some stuff, but I like the fact that you don't have to give up your position.
And just to close, do you feel like the added weight of the hybrid sort of had any impact on how difficult it was to get past?
No, I think the issue, I don't know how good of a race or how bad of a race it was in terms of overtaking. I would say that probably having the tire rule that we had here and that lap 1 incident kind of made the strategy a bit boring. Like you wouldn't see much stuff going on apart those 5-6 cars that started on blacks. But if we wouldn't have had that first lap incident, I think it would have been a great show.
I mean, should we just get on to his third answer as well, actually, about whether the hybrid did have an impact? Because I've got the passing stats here. There were 122 on-track passes in 2024, 97 of which were for position. And this year, there were only 75 on-track passes and 53 for position, which is a pretty significant downturn. And the biggest change since last year is the addition of the hybrid system and the added weight there. And, Palou said no, he doesn't believe that's the biggest factor. And ultimately believes the way that strategy unfolded in this race was maybe more, what caused the overtaking, I guess, deficit compared to last year. But I mean, we saw incidents at turn 3, for instance, in practice that, drivers complained were possibly a result of the added hybrid weight, just changing the handling a bit. And, that is the big change from last year, because this is a dramatic decrease. And okay, the hybrid system offers a bit of boost and extra overtake assistance, but, you've got to think it's had a bit of an impact on these passing stats, because that is a significant downturn.
Yeah, which is a shame. And look, I don't really recall that many on-track overtakes, which is the unfortunate thing. I think the tyres are a big issue. I mean, people would go onto the greens and get rid of them as soon as they possibly could. So you wouldn't really get that overtake as the strategies really mixed, because there wasn't really any point where the strategies were mixing, which sort of leads to that overtaking sometimes. So yeah, I think maybe a hybrid plays an impact, but I think once we get to places like Barber and Long Beach, we'll have more of a telling if that's the hybrid or just strategy. But I think Palou's point is valid, because you didn't have that crossover.
Yeah, I mean, it was an issue all weekend, these tyres being, we like tyre degradation. It's particularly cool on your short ovals, for instance. But yeah, I think it was almost a bit excessive. It was cool in qualifying. The tyre was kind of a one-lap tyre, and it put that pressure on drivers to really deliver on their one lap. But, come the race, no one wanted to be on the tyre. The objective of being on that tyre is to run it and pretty much just get rid of it, get the pain out of the way. So yeah, it did obviously lead to kind of different strategies, even at the end of the race converging. You had McLaughlin, who started on the alternates, and he ultimately ended up on the same strategy as those that started on the primaries. So yeah, I think that's also a big part, that, we like a high degrading tyre, but maybe it was a tiny bit excessive this weekend.
Álex Palou is often compared to Scott Dixon, so it's maybe time to move on to his Chip Ganassi Racing counterpart, who, if you didn't know, had the entire race without any radio. Couldn't hear what the stand was saying. Stan couldn't hear what he was saying. Saying clearly, at least there was some mumbles and some murmurs, but that was about it. So pretty tough race for Dixon. The first time in his career that he hasn't had a race with radio. So that was pretty difficult, and he's relying on the fuel light in his car on when to pit. And he believes that's what lost him the race. Palou obviously performed the undercut on Scott Dixon, which is usually the winning strategy on the streets of St. Petersburg. Dixon says he got traffic on his in-lap, that held him up, and he strongly believes if he'd been at the same time as Álex Palou, he would have been walking away from the weekend as the winner. So, bit of a shame for Dixon, because he said he was pretty pissed off at the result, which was rather notable, rather bluntly as well from Scott Dixon. So, he really thinks he should have won this weekend. He's never won at St. Petersburg, believe it or not, which is, I mean, the stat comes up every time we go to St. Petersburg every year. So I'm sure you've heard it already, but it is rather incredible for someone with such success. It just felt like a really good chance. But yeah, his radio not working cost him the strategy, and ultimately probably cost him the race. He obviously lost out to Newgarden briefly before getting him back on the final lap. So a bit of a shame for Dixon, because he had a good chance to win this one.
Yeah, and he really knew that. I think it's pretty rare that you see him this, as he said, pissed off. He seemed angry. It wasn't a case of, second, good start to the season, good points, and his usual kind of calm, collected self. Again, words we use for Palou, which I guess shows the likeness between the pair of them. But he was clearly frustrated and annoyed with the situation. I think Chip Ganassi as well said that, if all was well with Dixon, he probably would have won this race, and it just doesn't seem to be meant to be at St. Pete. That's the 5th time he's finished second on the streets of St. Pete. He's still never won that race. In
8 podiums.
8 podiums in his illustrious career, but just can't get the win. And I mean, he would have finished 3rd if Newgarden didn't have a couple of miscues with fuel, including at the end, which allowed Dixon to get by on that final lap. But I think bigger picture wise, it's a very good start to the season for Ganassi. They've not performed quite as well as the likes of your Penskes at St. Pete in recent years. But bringing home a 1-2 there, it's another fast start to the season for Dixon, which is something that has maybe let him down in recent years. Obviously, last year as well, he had a quick start to the season, and then his trademark very strong end to the season wasn't quite to be. But you can't imagine how hard it is to lose radio. I mean, it means he has no spotter, as he probably would see as preferable. He's having to do a strategy by himself. He's not aware exactly of, fuel consumption, for instance. And you just don't get that picture of the race that's so helpful to have. It's quite hard to know who is where and who's in what battle and who else is on what strategy as well. And yeah, ultimately it was, Dixon being forced to make his own decisions that cost him and led to him being, undercut in an unlikely fashion by Palou. But I think to finish second without a radio and all those circumstances against him was super impressive from Dixon. We also heard from Scott Dixon. This was actually ahead of the weekend. I asked him, there's obviously a lot of talk with Dixon heading into every season. This is season number 25, about records he could break. And I think come the Indy 500 this year, if he makes the race, that will actually be the race that puts him as the driver with the all-time most starts. I asked Dixon on Friday, what these records mean to him. A bit of a hint. They don't really mean a lot to him at this point in his career while he is still racing. And also asked Álex Palou ahead of the weekend, did he expect to be in this position where he's going for the three-peat and he's a three-time champion already after only 5 years in Indy? For Scott, coming into every season, you hear about records you could break. And as Dave says, 25 years, the sort of longevity. Does that concept of legacy, breaking records matter to you? And what are your feelings when you hear this sort of stuff?
I don't know. I just want to win. So... I don't know. I don't really look back. I just look, forward to the next race. Starting a new season. For me, the fire still burns very strong, and honestly, all I'm focused on is winning this weekend. So I think a lot of the times I've mentioned, I think once you leave the sport, hopefully you're happy with what you've achieved along the way. But I just care about this weekend, man.
And what would you say kind of remains the biggest motivation almost?
Getting beat. Probably the biggest motivation.
That's good stuff. And for Álex, it's been a massive rise for you over, only 5 years in IndyCar. When you kind of first moved over here with Dale Coyne Racing, what were your expectations? And did you expect to have 3 championships in 5 years in IndyCar?
No, I did not expect that. My expectation was to try and get be part of IndyCar, try and be here for a long time. But then, Chip decided to give me the best car and the best opportunity to try and win races from the second year. So I did not expect that, but I love it.
Let's move on to Team Penske because it's quite a mixed weekend for them. And this has always really been a Team Penske track. They have 11 wins here, which is crazy. 12 wins on the track. We won't really get into that too much. But they have a lot of wins here and a lot of poles. Pole last year, pole 22. Will Power got 9 poles in 11 years here. This is a Penske track through and through. They have dominated on the streets of St. Petersburg. I thought Scott McLaughlin was quite unlucky. Joseph Newgarden was about to say, they're all unfortunate in their own ways. I think we'll start with Scott McLaughlin because he took the pill. He crashed on Friday, first of all. It was a bigger looking crash than it actually was. It really wasn't a big accident at all. It was quite dramatic. Then he qualified in pole by 2 tenths, which was pretty impressive, and basically got caught out of his teammates' crash at the start with Louis Foster and who was the other one? It was Daniel Siegel at the start. And that caution, McLaughlin starting on the harder primary tyre, meant basically he's on the wrong strategy for the entirety of the race because the people starting on the alternates, which they wanted to get rid of, could do so. And that sort of stuffed McLaughlin from that point onwards, which is a bit of a shame because he's run really well here before. And ran well here last year before stuff. Ran well here in 2022, got his maiden victory. And it looked like he'd really be in the mix again. I mean, even so, he was in the mix, but he always just had a bit of work to do. So a bit unfortunate for Scott McLaughlin. I feel a bit bad for him because it was a great chance, but literally from lap 1, his race became undone for absolutely no fault of his own after what I thought was a good weekend.
Yeah, I mean, his weekend started with the announcement that he had signed a new long-term deal with Penske as well. I believe his last contract was signed in 2022, which was his second full season with the team. But he kind of just soft launched this new contract, and an Instagram caption said that during the off season they'd signed a new long-term agreement. So that takes that weight off. Obviously, teammate Will Power in a contract year, and I think I had seen it bandied about that McLaughlin was also in a contract year. but it never, ever seemed in doubt that he wouldn't continue with Penske. But yeah, great way to mark that contract with a crash in the first session of the season. But as you said, and as he said as well, I think the theatrics of the crash was what he described it as, were quite a lot more dramatic than it was. Kind of one of those caught out in turn 3, one of a few caught out in turn 3. Both Meyer Racing drivers had very impressive spins at what is an extremely high-speed corner, and quite miraculously, neither of them hit the wall. But McLaughlin wasn't quite as fortunate. He didn't actually spin. He just went in deep and kind of slapped the wall with his left side, and it was the left front that kind of looked like it just crumbled a little bit. But from there, he said the car, it was fixed, and Kyle Moyer was spotted in the paddock with pizzas. The crew left at about 8:30 on Friday, and the car just got better and better after being repaired. And he was the only Penske driver to make it through to the last round of qualifying, through to the Fast Six. And yeah, second pole in St. Pete after 22, when he obviously took his first win as well. But it just seemed like too much of a gamble. I think he and the team thought it was the right decision to start on the primaries. But given just how likely it is to get a caution at the start of a race on a street course like St. Pete, it seemed a gamble not to just start on the alternates, as was the most popular decision. I think it was maybe 16 of the field started on the alternates. And then, they could just, they didn't really have to take the pain of doing a stint on them. They could just get rid of them immediately, get onto the primaries. And McLaughlin actually started the race really well. He absolutely bolted away from Herta, who did seem to catch him, but then obviously the caution came out, and there were points in the race. Even he had a 10-second lead at one point, but he just wasn't on the right strategy. And unfortunately, I think by the end he was cornered into kind of, as I said earlier, converging with the strategy that the primary starters actually ended up being on as well, which just put him that step behind all of them. And he possibly was the strongest driver in the field. That just wasn't to be because of the strategy, really. We spoke to McLaughlin after qualifying, just getting a few details on his new deal with Penske, and also on his rise in IndyCar over the past 4 or 5 years. Scott, you signed a new deal with Team Penske, so I just wanted a few details. How long was this in the works? When did it get over the line? And ultimately, how does it feel to get that over the line as well?
Yeah, it's just over the off season, man. It was a simple sort of conversation we all had, and it was done pretty quickly, I guess. Pumped to do that, and good security for me and my family moving forward, and it's something that it takes another focus off. I don't have to answer questions about it. I just focus on and get going, I was pumped to get it done.
And this is still only your 5th season in IndyCar, and you've beaten your Penske teammates the last couple of years, won on every type of track now. So as you sign this new deal, if you're given time to kind of just reflect on the rise you've been on these last few years.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm proud of the opportunity to come here. I never thought I'd probably be here. I was talking today to a friend. I was 7 years in the main series in Australia, and now I'm in my 5th season in IndyCar. So I'm not far away from being longer in the professional IndyCar as a professional driver in the IndyCar series than the Supercar series. So it's kind of crazy how my life's changed. But love it. Love every second here. Enjoy America. I love it here, and don't really see any plans on leaving. So I'm really enjoying it.
Bit of a better tale for Jason Newgarden marginally. Finished in 3rd after qualifying. 10th again, was just on the right strategy. We didn't really see too much of him. It was just on the right strategy. Obviously got past Dixon. About 25 laps to go, and then lost on the final lap due to some pretty unfortunate fuel concerns, which had meant, but Dixon got past about 3 or 4 corners left. So that was pretty unfortunate for Newgarden. There was obviously a few questions asked about what had happened last year and if there was any motivation more to win this year. And he was quite firm, just saying, no, makes no difference to me. So I like that from Newgarden. I think from all the questions that he's asked about last year, it's probably good to get past this weekend with what is quite a decent result. So I think he'll be fairly happy with that. Obviously, he'll probably be slightly disappointed that he didn't quite get second, which looked highly probable for a large period of time. But not a bad weekend from Newgarden. I think that's what he needed, a nice, gentle weekend after obviously a difficult last year.
Yeah, I mean, there were just obviously a couple of concerns. It wasn't just the end of the race, actually. He had a don't know whether it was a miscalculation or a bit of a shortfall of fuel, but there was also a similar issue, I think, in the middle of the race as well, where didn't quite get a full fill of fuel or just a bit of a misread there. So not sure what happened there. And obviously that ultimately did cost him a position on the last lap, which I guess has got to be a bit frustrating. But no, overall, I feel like this was the sort of performance we didn't see enough of from Newgarden last year. He was, obviously we've spoken about it a lot, quite streaky last year. And this is just the sort of race I think he needed, just if nothing else, to kind of set the tone for this year.
Let's go on to Will Power, obviously the 13 Penske car. We've stated this a couple of times. It's a big year for him, contract year. David Malukas is looking at a seat. And yeah, bit of a tough weekend for Power. Qualified 13th, which isn't bad by any means, but sort of that dangerous mid-pack. And he's always been a very good qualifier, particularly at St. Petersburg. And just got caught up at that one accident. Rounds at the back of Nolan Siegel. 51.49% figure was quite unlucky. It's a bit weird because he slowed down and then sped up as he crashed into Siegel. It was a bit of a bizarre accident. So every race matters for Power really until the Indy 500, because that's when the contracts are going to be done. So this time really matters for him. What might be slightly encouraging news is David Malukas didn't have a fantastic weekend, but these races count, and for Power to be out on the opening lap was really a shame for him.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't set the right tone for the start of the season, I guess, in contrast to what we were saying with Newgarden. I mean, he ended the weekend on his third hybrid unit. It was his birthday on Saturday. First thing that happened was a hybrid failure in practice, and then before the race, he had another hybrid replaced, which that's not great. And ultimately, I think you always leave yourself a bit vulnerable to be caught up in an incident like that if you don't qualify nearer the front. And yeah, he was punished a bit there. And yeah, I mean, the incident is purely one of those that you just say is not the fault of anyone, really. There was a bit of a checkup that started from further forward. Power just got into the back of Siegel, maybe a little bit clumsy, but not much he could really do, and that sent them both into the wall. And obviously Louis Foster as well, just an innocent victim in that. So that was an unfortunate way to, I guess, kick the season off, but it's the sort of chaos we've come to expect at times. But it is probably the worst start Power really could have had in an important contract year. I guess ignoring the fact that the AJ Foyt Racing did have a slightly tougher weekend with both Malukas and Ferrucci.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a storyline we'd talk about until a decision is made. But as we said, these races matter for Power, and Malukas had a fairly anonymous weekend, which will help his cause. But you can't be relying on what David Malukas does. He's got to be relying on what he does, because that is what he can control. So we'll move on to some of the other championship contenders who had a particularly difficult weekend. I think Colton Herta is probably the first fair one to touch on. Qualified really well in second, had the perfect strategy on the alternate tyre, looked in the box seat for the opening stages of the race, and then it all became a bit undone. A slow pit stop made it a little bit difficult, but certainly was still in a really good position, and then had to refuel the car due to some fuel issue at the first stop. And pretty much from that point onwards, an extra 28-30 seconds in pit road will pretty much take you out of any form of contention. And Herta ended up in a fairly disappointing 16th place. So a weekend which showed a lot of promise for Colton Herta. But he talks about, you can't have these weekends, and that's what every driver speaks about. You can only afford one or two of these weekends a season, and you don't want to be using it on the very first race. So a bit of a shame for Colton Herta there, because he looked like he would be a contender throughout the weekend.
Yeah, I guess we'll come on to Andretti a little bit more, but they kind of through practice looked like they were the quickest team. Kyle Kirkwood topped practice on Friday, and ultimately they come home with fifth with Kirkwood, sixth with Ericsson, which is decent. But then Herta down in 16th. This was a sort of race where you would have thought that, given what they delivered at the start of the weekend, you probably would have expected one of the Andretti cars fighting closer towards the podium. And at the end of the day, Herta probably would have been that driver if it wasn't for these issues. And I think one thing that I did really like that I kind of picked out was just the sense of leadership he showed actually on the radio. There was no panic, there was no frustration, there was no blaming anyone after, both the pit stop that was slow and also the fuel issue, which that was just a major inconvenience, because he had to come in and it wasn't at a point where he needed to change tyres or anything as well. But yeah, instead he just asked what he could do to help on the radio. He kept calm. I think that was a sign of a bit improved maturity from Herta, actually, that we've not necessarily seen in the past. This was a sort of stage where you'd see him maybe become a bit desperate in the race, and ultimately to salvage 16th, it is not an impressive result on its own, but sort of result you could look at the end of the year and think that was important.
It was a tough weekend throughout for somebody else who perceived to be a championship contender at the early stages, just with Pato O'Ward, who's typically been strong at St. Petersburg, defending winner last year, probably should have won the race the year before that as well. So O'Ward's won Roe recently, and the odds are very much in his favour, but he qualified really uncharacteristically poorly. Couldn't seem to get tyres up to temperature, couldn't really seem to get any pace in his McLaren, and qualified a pretty pitiful 23rd by Pato O'Ward's standards. So that was very uncharacteristic. Started on the primary tyre, which, as we know, was the wrong tyre to start on. But even worse for O'Ward, because that set had a puncture on it, so he had to pit at the same time as all the alternate runners had pitted, and therefore he had to run the really unfavoured alternates for a longer stint. Made him have to do an extra stop in the cycle. He recovered to 11th, which all things considered isn't too bad considering the perils that O'Ward went through. But similarly to Herta, you can't afford these weekends outside the top 10 on a very regular basis, particularly for my prediction I made 2 weeks ago. They finished in the top 10 in every race apart from one. Well, I've already used my joker card there. So can O'Ward do me a favour? We'll have to find out. But you can't afford these weekends. So that is the main thing. And it all comes down to qualifying once again. Yes, I know he was unfortunate with the puncture being on the wrong strategy, but starting 23rd doesn't make your life very easy.
Yeah, I mean, every championship bidding driver that we heard from across the weekend essentially said, you want to start the season with a top 5. So anything below that, it's just not ideal. I think we saw, to a greater extent last season with Scott McLaughlin, obviously on 5 points, bottom of the championship after 2 races. You're kind of just constantly chasing, likewise with Joseph Newgarden, and you don't want to be in that position where you're chasing. You want to be in control. I mean, it was unusual, O'Ward's qualifying, to say the least. I mean, I think he was half a second off getting into the Fast 12 and 0.7 seconds off teammate Nolan Siegel. And you see him down there and you kind of think, okay, he must have been blocked or he must have had a little issue. But no, again, it was kind of that case of he seemed a little bit uncertain why he had no pace, why he couldn't switch the tyres on. And ultimately in the race, I think they made probably the very best of a very bad situation. It was a bad qualifying. It was a bad start to the race. And then they're actually running, I think, 6th in the closing stages and obviously had to pit again late on. But actually to salvage 11th is pretty good. And similar to what I said with Herta, it's the sort of result that standalone isn't that impressive, but you could come to look at it at the end of the season and think, that could have been 20th. It's better than it could have been.
Yeah, it's a very respectable recovery drive from O'Ward, especially somewhere where, as we said, it was difficult to overtake, and O'Ward was stuck in traffic for a lot of the race just because he was so out of sync with the strategy. So that was a bit of a shame. But yeah, also, I mean, the puncture was unlucky. Without the puncture, maybe he's in the conversation for sort of top 8, top 5, but it wasn't to be. And you're already paying catch up, which you don't really want to do against somebody like Álex Palou, because you can't really do much catching up against Álex Palou.
Yeah, I mean, still, he was the biggest mover in the race, even with the puncture. So that's a really impressive performance, I think. Genuinely a really, really impressive performance. I think he must have had some pretty good pace to have made that much headway. Even in light of what happened, a pretty disastrous start.
It's a fairly mixed weekend, but I think there was a lot of people who just didn't see all race, but actually drove quite well. There was quite a lot. We start off Carl Kirkwood in 5th, Marcus Ericsson in 6th. Ericsson finished top 7 every single session. Andretti strong once again. Ericsson qualified 7th as well. Kirkwood qualified 9th. So these weekend for Andretti get very quiet apart from Herta, but this is what I said a few weeks ago. Carl Kirkwood is putting in these underrated performances, bagging these top 5s. Not really anybody paying attention. So that was a pretty good run for a team we saw pretty much nothing of, I think.
They rolled off extremely well in opening practice. Obviously, Kirkwood topped that session, but there's always time across the weekend for other teams to catch up. And okay, Andretti had a good baseline, but you had a lot of teams in the mix there. I mean, the Fast 6 in the end were the only team with 2 cars was actually Meyershank Racing, which I guess just showed how competitive it ended up being. But, obviously Kirkwood's first season with Andretti as second in the series, we made a lot of the fact that his consistency just wasn't there. I think he was in the top 10 maybe 7 or 8 times, and his only 2 top 5 finishes were his wins. And he really overhauled that last year. Both him and Herta were in the top 10 and 13 times. And this has just been exactly that sort of start to Kirkwood's season, I would say. It was a quiet day, but a quiet top 5 day is what we kind of longed to see from him in that first year with Andretti. And a quiet top 6 day is what Marcus Ericsson became renowned for with Chip Ganassi Racing, and that's not what we saw last year. So I think from his perspective, that is a really, really strong start to the season. It's just the sort of performance that we barely really saw last season, but he was right up there with his teammates this weekend, where he wasn't necessarily all the time last year.
Felix Rosenqvist from a decent run out is 7th for Meyer Shank Racing. He ran quite well here last year, qualified 3rd. Rosenqvist's qualifying performance he's had last year was really, really impressive, and is continuing that into street courses early on this year. Marcus Armstrong was obviously running quite well as well, qualified in 4th place, so they started it really well. Armstrong made his own error, hit the wall, sort of seemed to get his rear right a little bit loose, which put his day undone, which is, it's Armstrong's now a 3rd-year driver and needs to start cutting out these small mistakes out of his game, because Meyer Shank Racing is showing quite a bit of potential. Obviously, their new alliance, Chip Ganassi Racing, which, I mean, they were at the front last year and aligned with Andretti Global, and they're still at the front now of Chip Ganassi Racing. So, pretty good run out for Rosenqvist. Again, maybe he feels like he could have done a little bit better considering where he qualified, but in fairness, he did start on the much unfavoured primary tyre. So, not too bad of a run out for Rosenqvist there, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it was super impressive. I think arguably their 3rd and 4th place results in qualifying, looking at that second row, is one of the most impressive things we saw this weekend. Again, Rosenqvist, he's certainly one of the most underrated drivers in the series. Obviously, didn't quite pan out in the race, but he only had 1 top 10 finish, I think, in the last 10 or 11 races last season, because things just kept going wrong for him after 5 in the first 6. So to finish that is still a really, really good start to the season for him. And yeah, I think with Armstrong, it's just execution, because he's there, he's competitive, he's got the pace, but just like last year, he crashed out in St. Pete when running pretty well. He's ended up retiring again this year. So just not the end to the weekend that he would have wanted. But that's an awesome effort in qualifying, because, okay, they had the Ganassi relationship, but they, as often was the case with Andretti last year, they actually have outperformed their allies in qualifying.
I think we should also give a word to Christian Lundgaard, who had a pretty decent weekend, qualified in the Fast 6 in his first appearance for Aaron McLaren, running a bit more of a red livery, a bit more an orange livery compared to the sort of white one that Rossi ran last year. Seagulls and O'Wards are identical, but Lundgaard's, yes, better or worse? I think a bit better.
Better than Seagulls or Rossi's?
Rossi's.
You see, I did really like Rossi's, but it felt like maybe as a one-off, it was almost nicer. I think this is cool. It's distinctive. I like the. Yeah, I got a bit, sorry, not orange papaya. As
I got a bit bored of Rossi's towards the end. I think it got a bit. It's all right. But anyway, Christian Lundgaard, good weekend. Qualified 5th. Ran pretty well, got the 3rd most laps out of anybody. That's mainly because he was just off strategy the entire race, like Rossi was for the entirety of last year in that number 7 team. So ran pretty well. Obviously started on the primaries, which you didn't want to start on around the greens a little bit later than everybody else. Ended up P8, which was okay. Decent start to life for Lundgaard at Aaron McLaren, that's got to be said. Yeah, good weekend for Lundgaard. Good first impressions in a team that Rossi and Rosenqvist haven't quite shined in. So I know they both did decent in their debuts, but good foundations for life at McLaren for Christian Lundgaard.
I think it's a pretty pertinent point you make, actually, about running off strategy as Rossi often did. I think that was probably one of Rossi's biggest frustrations with Aaron McLaren, was the strategy and just generally observing from the outside that the strategy seems a bit odd sometimes. And okay, it did ultimately take him to an 8th place finish, which is pretty good going. And I think Lundgaard actually built up really nicely through the weekend. Through the practice sessions, ultimately made it into the Fast 12 as the quickest qualifier on the team. The only Aaron McLaren car that made it into the Fast 6, in fact. Obviously led off strategy, and I think he had to do that alternate stint later in the race, which probably wasn't quite the way to go, but it's still a very solid start.
We won't touch on it too long, but I want to touch on the rookies because they had a pretty rough time. I think Louis Foster's IndyCar debut lasted all of 3 corners, getting caught up in the Power Seagull crash. Jacob Abel finished a lap down. He posted something in a story. It was one of those for Jacob Abel who just wanted to get it over with. Saw it was pretty difficult. But he had a problem with some kind, I believe. I can't remember what it is off the tip of my tongue. But he had some issue, I believe. And then
his Instagram post was basically just kind of bemoaning the degradation. I think it was a bit higher than expected, possibly on the primaries was what he said. Also just fuel numbers and stuff. It's all learning. It's all good learning. You can't expect the world early on for a team that wasn't that competitive last year.
And then Robert Schwartzman finished 20th in the end. PREMA was 19th or 20th. A pretty quiet first weekend for PREMA. I mean, which is, I guess, in some ways what you want. But I think both Schwartzman and I said they wanted a little bit more than 19th or 20th, the last 2 cars on the lead lap. So a fairly quiet debut for PREMA. Things could definitely get better. But, you know, they've got a full race running in, which I think is probably it's definitely the foundations that you need.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, if I was them, and I know they obviously have high expectations, so they're not going to be happy with 19th and 20th, but that's pretty solid. I think to say to them, you're going to have both cars on the lead lap, you're going to get through the race without issue. I think you'd be pretty content with that. I mean, it's completely different, but I flicked on the World Endurance Championship race over the weekend, and it was Aston Martin's debut with the Valkyrie. And I think within an hour or two, all of their cars, or both of their cars, were about 10 laps off.
The door was flapping. Doors
were flying off. And PREMA had none of that, really. I mean, they had a few issues through practice, I think.
A door flying off would be impressive with an IndyCar.
Schwartzman, I think, had radio issues in practice, which, you know, that's not ideal. That's limiting for him. So, obviously, with a bit of a lack of practice laps.
You don't hear about it because it's not Scott Dixon.
Another radio issue, isn't it? Yeah, but he started 18th, qualified 18th, and that's pretty good going. That and ultimately finished 20th on his debut, first IndyCar race. You know, doesn't know the track, has never raced on a street track like this. That's pretty good. I think supposedly
Dennis Hauger compares it to Monaco. So
wow. Interesting.
I disagree with you.
Interesting. But no, anyway, Callum Ilott, I think he replaced his hybrid actually before qualifying. So again, occasional gremlins, that's to be expected. Ended up last on the grid, but I mean, he was running around the top 10 at points. He actually ended up in the runoff, I think, at turn 10 at one point, which lost him a little bit of time. But it was a good run. He was, again, they were competitive, and I think that's about all you can ask for as a new team.
All right, let's go through the running order as we always do. We'll briefly touch on any more key storylines throughout the field. Palou, Dixon, Newgarden was your podium, followed by McLaughlin and Kirkwood rounding out your top 5. Ericsson, Rosenqvist and Lundgaard, a little bit of a Scandinavian trio there in 6th, 7th and 8th. And regular listeners of the podcast have probably waited all year for this segment. I'd always say, no, Archie, we don't want to make this episode 2 hours long, so keep it brief about Readers VeeKay as we can, please.
I mean, it was pretty bloody impressive. I mean, that Dale Coyne Racing team, their best race result last year was 13th. I think maybe 3 occasions they managed that, a couple of times with Jack Harvey, Toby Sowery as well. So for Rinus VeeKay to finish 9th, the team's first top 10, I think, since David Malukas in Portland in 2023, pretty remarkable stuff. I mean, this is a guy who's been with this team for, probably not even a month. And I know he obviously did the test with them and worked with them in Indy, the Indianapolis Oval hybrid test back in October, but he's not been properly embedded and signed in this team for long at all. So I've got down to business and be performing like this so quickly, I think is super impressive and testament to the pedigree that I do believe that VeeKay has as a driver. And I think Dan's smirking, but I do believe it. VeeKay was running top 10 and stayed there pretty much all race. And just an awesome run. I mean, it's better than anything Coyne managed last year by quite a distance. So, pretty remarkable start.
Regular listeners of the podcast will get used to this segment across the course of the year. So, Marissa, if you're new to the podcast, I think Archie of Rinus VeeKay is the longest running joke on this podcast. So, Alexander Rossi finished in 10th in his debut for Ed Carpenter Racing, started 20th, so that actually was a pretty decent effort from Rossi, to be fair. Teams obviously made a lot of changes, and that wasn't too bad at all. We didn't see any of Rossi, really. But
I mean,
decent.
He was on the Lundgaard strategy. Him and Lundgaard were kind of the top two for that period.
Typical Rossi and Lundgaard, that two number 7 McLarens being on the stupidest strategy of them all.
I think they just had I think they were really quick on the primaries in first practice, put the alternates on, they were shocking. Qualifying, they were pretty shocking on the alternates as well. But there's clearly pace there that Rossi made this progress. That's a really good drive, I think, actually. And you'll touch on Rasmussen as you go through the order, but to finish 15th, it's not too bad. They're both in the top 10 in opening practice in the kind of all-car segment.
Talking of the alternates, why do you still have a guayule tyre? I've never understood the real point in it.
I mean, Sky Sports listeners will be very familiar with that word because Tom Gaymore is a big fan of the guayule. But it is something, I don't know. It's a sustainable tyre made out of Mexican something or other.
Yeah,
made out of some Mexican thing.
It was introduced a few years ago, and I thought this was like a one-off thing. But no, the guayule tyre is like really popular. It's just, so if you didn't know, the guayule tyre is like a green band. It's like the softer red tyre, but it's only used, I believe, in all the street courses. So they introduced it in Nashville a couple of years ago, and yeah.
It's derived from desert shrub. I believe it was something to do with Mexican desert shrub.
So how does that form a tyre, I think, is the biggest question I still don't know. So
I don't know, but it's a sustainable tyre. Let's have an interest.
I think that is the second biggest mystery this podcast has ever had. No, the third biggest mystery. But one that got resolved. The first biggest mystery is what on earth polka dot is. We've been going a year and a half in the saga, and we still don't know what polka dot is. So if anyone knows what polka dot is, let us know. The second big mystery was what happened to Rossi on the final lap of last year's Indy 500. We got that one sorted. He had to check up in the final corner. That was a big mystery for ages. And maybe this is the third big mystery. How does guayule become a tyre?
I am currently putting a note to actually email Firestone and try and find out how it's made.
There we are. Well, some exclusive. Maybe we should get the head of Firestone on to explain the guayule tyre. I mean, it's been going for 3 years, but if listeners want to hear about the guayule tyre, let us know.
If I do get around to sending this email and I get a response, podcast listeners will hear it first, and you'll probably get a piece up on the DiveBomb site as well if there's enough in there.
So Bridgestone probably aim to commercialise guayule by 2030. So there we are. Maybe they're testing it for road courses. But yeah, maybe we'll do some research with it. Maybe it's our topic for next week. We'll find out what the guayule tyre is and bring it back to you for Long Beach. That's the next street race, sorry. So we'll find out for them. Anyway, we've got distracted with the guayule, but I think that was a good distraction there. Pat O'Ward was 11th, followed by Graham Rahal in 12th. AJ Foot Racing in 13th and 14th. Bit of an underwhelming weekend with Malukas leading the two of them. Rasmussen was in 15th ahead of Colton Herta. Connor Daly, who mid-weekend switched from, wasn't mid-weekend, it was prior to the weekend, switched from number 78 to number 76, because I believe 76 is a chain of gas stations in the United States. So for sponsorship reasons, he's moved to number 76. But that, seriously, is quite good news, because obviously we said a few weeks ago, Daly's sponsorship was quite a lot in danger due to Polka Dot dropping out. However, this should give him a bit more security towards the end of the season, which is great. Kevin Simpson was in 18th ahead of the two Premas in 19th, 20th, followed by Schwartzman. Stingray Rob obviously was holding up below for ages. He was 21st. Now, Devin DiFrancesco, we had a very Devin DiFrancesco weekend. A surprisingly decent qualifying in 14th just to finish a lap down. That's the epitome of Devin DiFrancesco. Yeah,
I think actually you would say that DiFrancesco's strength probably is qualifying. It's hard to kind of weigh up at Andretti, saying that, okay, he qualified 18th twice in St. Pete. With Andretti, maybe not great. But to actually to start this race down it was 14th, wasn't it? That's
parallel.
Pretty good. But it has been race day that's long been the issue for DiFrancesco, and just under delivers a bit, doesn't execute on the pace. So that's something he needs to really develop.
Jacob Abel was ahead of, so Jacob Abel was the last car running. Obviously, as we said, had a few issues of tyre degradation, followed by Marcus Armstrong, who said clumsily hit the wall by himself, which put an end to his day, followed by Nolan Siegel, Will Power, and Louis Foster, who were all involved in the lap one incident. Regular listeners of the podcast will know we like to do 2 awards at the end of every weekend. First of all, as we said, the unsung hero, somebody who doesn't get the recognition they deserve for the weekend. All the spotlight's given to the winners and the podium sitters and the crashers, but not the people in the middle. So I feel like I know who yours might be, but take it away.
Have I sung too much about VeeKay for him to be unsung?
Oh, well, there's a shocker.
No, I will go for VeeKay, I think.
Okay, cool. I will sing the praises of Carl Kirkwood once again, as I did very heavily in the predictions episode, because 5th place, and yet we saw absolutely none of it. But that's a very good run up for Carl Kirkwood, I think, and nobody's talking about it.
Any honourable mentions? I actually
You
think,
love an honourable mention, don't
I
you?
do. I actually think Pato O'Ward's a pretty good honourable mention for his drive, given all the adversity there
Yeah,
as well.
I think Ericsson's worth a shout, and I actually think Lundgaard's in quite a shout as well.
There's a lot, to be fair.
There is a lot.
You know,
I think outside the top 4, there is like from there on downwards, there's like about 6 or 7 in a row. You could arguably,
yeah.
quite
From
take it.
from 5th to 12th, Kirkwood, Ericsson, Rosenqvist, Lundgaard, VeeKay, Rossi, O'Ward, and Rahal, I think are probably all in with a shout.
Absolutely. Right, new for this year, we're going to do a top 3 drivers of the weekend. For now, we will include the winner, but if you don't want us to include the winner in future dates, let us know. But for now, we will include the winner of our top 3 drivers of the weekend. I'm pretty set on mine, I think. We'll start off with a third. Who are you going for?
I probably can't go with VeeKay because he was my unsung hero. I'll probably go for. I think I'll probably go for Dixon.
Okay, I was going to go for Palou.
Okay.
Second, I've got Dixon.
I've gone for Palou second. So they're interchangeable, I think.
Fine, and I guess you got McLaughlin first.
McLaughlin, yeah, is my number 1. I think if he was on the right strategy, he probably would have won the race.
Yeah, for me, Dixon, again, if he had the radio, quite possibly would have run the race and qualified better than Palou. What is it now? 45 fast 6 in a row where Dixon hasn't qualified on pole?
I mean, they were talking about this. I don't think he's been on pole since Watkins Glen in 2017 on a road and street course.
Yeah, it is,
which is astonishing.
And yet he's been in almost 50 fast 6 appearances.
I'm not even sure he has double figures. I'm not even sure he has double figures of poles on road and street courses. It was actually Watkins Glen 2016, so a year even further back.
We're coming up to a decade of Scott Dixon not having a pole on a road and street course.
That's mad to think about.
And by that time, if he doesn't get on before then, it will have been 50 fast 6 appearances without getting on tops. You feel like you'd get one by chance at that point. I don't know, by everybody else crashing out in a session or something. That's bonkers. Bonkers. That is maybe one of the most mind-blowing stats. There's a lot of mind-blowing stats, but I think that's my favourite that's running around.
I guess it shows the raceability, though, in IndyCar, that this is probably arguably the greatest driver ever, or top 2 greatest drivers ever statistically. And he doesn't really rely on poles. He can just race so well.
Anyway, we've got a topic. McLaughlin, I think my driver of the weekend, qualified really well, bounced back from that crash in practice and probably should have won the race and did what he could in a bad strategy.
He was so far ahead of anyone else on his strategy. It was pretty obscene.
And as we always do, we try and pick out some of the funniest moments from the weekend. Now, I think this is quite a difficult one, in my opinion. Not too much really springs to mind straight away for any funny moments. Pato O'Ward signed a grown man's chest with a Sharpie.
That's pretty good.
If you haven't seen it, it's probably the weirdest things ever signed. But yeah, Pato O'Ward signed a grown man's chest with a Sharpie this weekend. So that was not the content anyone was expecting to hear when they loaded up this episode on Spotify or YouTube or however you're watching. Bit of a different one.
I've got one. Colton Herta's tweet, which was actually after the race, but making light of some of Fox's graphics, their cartoon graphics of drivers. And Herta said, "If I wake up in a cold sweat tonight, you know why." And it was a picture of McLaughlin looking a little bit like an alien in his cartoon. I thought that was pretty amusing.
I think that's a nice segue onto Fox, because we do need to speak about Fox's IndyCar broadcasting debut this weekend. First time we had them ever broadcasting IndyCar. So Townsend Bell, James Hinchcliffe obviously returning alongside Will Buxton, who obviously joined us on the show a couple of weeks ago. So a bit of a different face to Lee Diffie, who we've had the last couple of years. But I like the energy from Will Buxton. Good energy, brought the excitement. Not obviously not to the same degree as Diff, but brought excitement. Was good to listen to, which I thought was quite fun. Seemed to it felt quite natural in the booth, which I thought was quite good. So what do we like about Fox's coverage? Well, I think there was some good bits. Obviously, we had the added bit of the drones, and there was those features on the aero screens and those little graphics there. What is a bit of a shame is obviously being in the UK, we get the international feed, and on the international feed, we don't seem to get all these features all the time. If there's anyone else in the UK or internationally, though, you'll feel that Fox will be the same in NBC, in fairness, but they'll speak about sections and they'll say, "Oh, if you look at this graphic here," and then we can't see the graphic, which isn't anybody's fault, but it's just an experience we get here. If there's any specific graphics that we haven't seen,
and I think the reason behind that is supposedly to do with sponsors and some of the US sponsors that can't be shown for obvious reasons on different channels, different networks over internationally. So
some graphics we don't always see, which can be a bit frustrating because we don't actually get the whole picture of it. But some of the stuff out there, such as the drone shots, for example, were a good addition. And even the graphics we did see, there was a few more information about who's on pit lane and what sort of thing. Pit lane announcers, I don't think we touched on last week because they were announced really, really late on into the week. So Jack Harvey's doing the full season apart from the Indianapolis 500 because he'd be racing there. We've got Kevin Lee, who obviously was at NBC for a while, and this weekend we had Jamie Little. It will be Georgia Henbury, who was at NBC previously for IndyCar, but she just gave birth. So first of all, congratulations to Georgia Henbury, and looking forward to having her at the track. But obviously more pressing matters this weekend for her. So we had Jamie Little, Jack Harvey, and Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee, very reliable figure. I mean, everyone loves a bit of Kevin Lee and love him on the Indy Next commentary. Jack Harvey was there for the first time, and I thought he did a pretty good job. Did Jack Harvey as well. Obviously, he definitely progressed throughout the weekend, and he definitely got more comfortable with it, which was great to see. And Jamie Little's been doing it for a long time in the NASCAR scene, so was very reliable there as well.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously saw so much encouraging stuff across the off-season from Fox, and I guess this was the other side of the coin, and this is kind of where all the extra eyes that you've gained from this massive push of commercials really comes to count. And I think the word I would use to describe the first weekend is probably promising. I think I used this at the top of the show as well. I think from a broadcast standpoint, it was promising. I think from what we saw from the production, I felt that it just made IndyCar feel important, maybe more important than it felt on NBC, if that actually makes sense. I think, looking at the pylon, everything was kind of clear. It was pretty bold, and I think they did a pretty good job with infographics and stuff as well. You had an introduction to the car before the race. They made really clear what the rules were in every.
They've got the model card to show you intricacies as well, which is cool.
Yes, they had a new display on the aero screen to show the telemetry, which with NBC was always on the bottom of the pylon, which didn't always make a ton of sense. I believe
we couldn't see it either on the international feed.
No, we couldn't always see that on the international feed.
We saw it once or twice, I feel like, though.
Yeah, it was a little bit. I think there were a few issues with the international feed, a few issues across the weekend, which did mean that the first practice session wasn't actually shown on Sky over in the UK. But no, I like the kind of aesthetic that they delivered. I thought it kind of really caught the eye. I think it was pretty creative, some of the shots they did with drones, etc. They did an awful lot, I thought, to showcase the drivers. You had cut scenes, you had features. There was a feature before the race with O'Ward and Herta, kind of just looking around St. Pete and that sort of area, which I thought was nice. It made the coverage a lot more personal. And I think, the highlight for me was the grid kind of introducing themselves as it was going through the starting grid. It was.
Although, what subtly annoyed me is everyone did it slightly differently the way they did that intro. It's a little bugbear.
And I actually saw someone mention this on Twitter. Scott Dixon did it in a very clever way where he incorporated his sponsor in a position where they just couldn't cut it because it was between him saying his name and where he was from. But I thought that was cool, from. They've obviously said storytelling is kind of the key goal, and I think there was definitely an effort there to make the drivers the showpiece, which I think has lacked in the past. I thought the pre-race actual build-up was pretty good, and actually they used warm-up to have a bit of like a almost talk show to preview it, which again I thought was good. The bit of a couch setup, which again we couldn't see internationally. But even just little details like Indy Next through practice qualifying, they had the actual booth rather than the radio booth that they had in the past, and it was all on TV obviously as well. So they're clearly putting effort into that. And I thought the actual presentation, to be honest, was pretty close to flawless. Like the booth gelled pretty well. It wasn't like it was a new team working together as it actually was. Obviously they've worked in different places here and there, but I thought Will Buxton, it was like he hadn't really been out of the booth. He was enthusiastic, knowledgeable, clear, and I just thought very, very assured, and it was an enjoyable dynamic, I thought. And yeah, the pit reporting team, I think it was nice that they tapped into some of the familiar names with experience, with knowledge. Jamie Little, I thought, was really good moving over as well for this temporary period. I think Jack Harvey as well. It was good to have that sort of fresh face with very recent knowledge. And I think he improved every session. It felt pretty natural. So yeah, I'd say positive start in pretty much all departments, apart from some kind of efficiency things that I think we'll mention now.
I think the main issues are graphics, really. First of all, the timing tower doesn't seem to match up the transponders, so there'll just be random jumps of people teleporting to first and teleporting off the order, which make it
Connor Daly took the lead at one point in the race.
Yeah, that was a huge issue of just the transponders obviously not matching up, and you have people moving up and down, and that was a bit of an issue. I think qualifying was the most infuriating session because obviously NBC, you had that sort of live tracker on the side of green and red and their split time. Obviously IndyCar don't really have sector times. But even so, you were just sort of guessing at the end of a lap where they would be, which isn't great for the viewing experience. And even then, they'd set their time, and then it'd take about another 10 seconds to move them on the leaderboard.
And I just to interject, I don't think NBC did it in the perfect way either. I think Fox could do it in a more simple way than NBC did, because it wasn't always clear whether you were looking at the delta time to, whether it was to your own time, to first, to the cut. So I think Fox could do it better than NBC, but the fact there was nothing there made it quite hard to follow.
Yeah, I mean, you were just guessing, and as I said, it'd take a few seconds to move somebody up the leaderboard, which got a bit confusing. There was also that graphic, it's got like a bit of a pointy outy shape on the side, and it's a bit misleading, especially in qualifying, because it looks like a different amount of people go through to what actually go through. So
yeah, they didn't. I don't think they outlined the transfer zone clearly enough, because if you are a fan who hasn't watched qualifying before, or maybe you don't understand how qualifying works, you're not going to have any idea, and you probably would have thought the top 9 go through, given just the way the graphic is.
Yeah, and the line there was a bit weird and a bit misleading. So I think those were the major issues.
I think it was most glaring in qualifying. Like I think there were a few just general bugs with it as well. I think there were cases of the pylon just disappearing a bit early, as you said, maybe not updating. And I guess it's understandable. It's the first time it's been used. I think I actually think at the end of sessions they can do a better job at actually showing the results, because if you are telling the story throughout the session but don't actually complete the picture in the story, it's not great. I think opening practice they only ended up showing the top 10, I think, and Indy Next they only showed the front row after qualifying, and maybe that's because they've got to get to another channel for another sport to cover or whatever, and it's a bit of a rush, broadcast windows, etc. But even in qualifying, they and NBC again, I think NBC only used to show the drivers who didn't make it, and Fox only showed the drivers who did make the cut after every session. So again, it's not perfect.
I think we didn't see push to pass graphics. Tyre compound, this was an issue of NBC as well in the international feed. Tyre compound still isn't clear who's on what compound. And there was another small thing, which was I can't remember. That's really annoying.
I mean, do you want me to run
hybrid? Hybridization was the other one. Hybrid.
Got you. Yeah, I mean, my list was pretty similar stuff. Again, qualifying, we've kind of run through that, but even stuff like just a delta to the individual drivers' previous times, I think would be pretty useful, because you can't always tell, how they're improving or whether they're not improving. And again, this is NBC, I think, did qualifying in a bit of a confusing way, but it's better than not showing it at all. And Fox just, they didn't show enough of those details. And actually, looking at the pylon itself, there was often actually a gap at the bottom, which I felt could have been filled with some information. And actually, there were points in the race where it showed the top 5 in very, very big form with their faces and stuff, which hid other parts of the order. You could only see down to like P13, I think.
I think also the text at the top would be rather small at times, which said Grand Prix of St. Petersburg.
Yeah, and especially the Indy Next, it said Round 1 Grand Prix of St. Petersburg, and you had to squint to read it. Even the lap count was a little bit small at times, I thought.
And we don't get an international feed, but they basically brought back these cartoons. I think it's a Fox thing. People are a bit bored of them now. It's like a cool thing during COVID. And they're just persisting with these cartoons, which people don't really like. It's fine the international feed because we don't get them, but if you're US based, you will get the cartoons, which
again, this is all being quite pernickety. Like, just a few other stuff. I think tire compounds is one of the most crucial things, because qualifying as well, you don't know who's set a lap on what compound of tire, whether it's the harder or the softer tire. I think push to pass is big as well. That was something that NBC did pretty well, was showing push to pass and, yeah, as you say, hybrid. I just feel like the pylon was bold, it was clear. It felt a bit big at some points. It felt like a bit of an interference, especially when they had the big top five. And then when they did show tire compounds, it was kind of outside the pylon, and it covered, a good quarter, third of the screen. I also wonder whether the pylon could be a little bit transparent as well, because it does block quite a bit of the screen. But again, these are small little details. A few other clarity things that I mentioned was it wasn't always clear immediately when it went to a caution, for instance.
Yeah, because NBC, you'd find a caution out because it was on the pylon before the flags.
Yeah, it wasn't like a clear yellow. It was kind of, they tried to make it into an effect where it almost looked like the flag, I think. Ultimately, it was never going to be perfect. And I think
the production, I think, was good. The graphics need some work, but that'll obviously come with time. And I'm sure even by fan, we'll have some of these things changed.
Yeah, and generally, it was really positive. I thought it was an engaging watch, and, there were new innovations, which I think were great to see.
So a lot of what we've spoken about in the off-season is obviously the Fox promotion and promoting the personalities of driver as opposed to the racing in the series itself. In the build-up to the races weekend, we got the thoughts of James Hinchcliffe and Townsend on this topic, as well as asking them what Fox would add to the IndyCar broadcast.
It's a great question. It reminds me a lot, going way back to, I guess, my rookie year in kart at the time, 2002. There was more driver-focused promotion on the personalities. I love what Fox has done, not just to tell the driver stories, but the way in which they've done that, to take a 30-second spot and in 30 seconds really try to show you who Pato O'Ward is, or who Joseph Newgarden is, or who Álex Palou is. I thought they did a brilliant job. It was high production value. They certainly deployed those spots in the highest possible visibility around the Super Bowl. I talked to Pato O'Ward, in fact, this morning about that. He said it was like he won the Indy 500, the amount of text messages he got. He said, I heard from girls I haven't heard from in 10 years that were watching the Super Bowl that started texting me. So I just love that approach. And I think we have so many characters in IndyCar outside of those three, and they will reveal themselves on Sunday and throughout the season. But it's a great start and a great reminder of why we should all care. And I think Fox has just done an awesome job out of the gate. So I'm really pumped about that. I think it's the right approach. It's the reason we watch the key characters in any main sport, whether that's football or basketball. I was joking on a Fox call earlier this morning that I only just now learned about the Mad Hungarian in Major League Baseball from the 80s. But those characters, they reveal themselves. We celebrate that. And as Will said, we're there to spotlight those personalities and all of the dynamics around them as it happens. And we're never disappointed at St. Pete. So just can't wait to see what happens.
No, I think he pretty much summed it up. I sat in 11 years of preseason meetings with various, IndyCar management and ownership, and got told every year, hey, the focus is to make the drivers stars. And every year we came up pretty short on executing on that. And by contrast, what we've seen out of Fox so far has been exactly that, to the point where, I was speaking to Joseph, and kind of in the same vein as what Townsend was touching on with Pato. He says he gets recognized more walking down the streets in Nashville now than he did after winning his second Indy 500. So that just shows you how much this is working. I've met people that are from Indianapolis that are very casual observers. They maybe watch the 500 every year and that's it. Ran into one at the airport the other day saying, man, IndyCar's killing it right now. Those commercials are great. I think I want to go to a race other than Indy this year. Never done it. He's grown up in Indiana. He's 40 years old. And for the first time, he wants to go to a race outside of the 500. the commercials are working, the approach is working, and that starts with the drivers. We're not tuning in to watch cars go in circles. When you think of when, NASCAR really hit its big peak in the kind of early 2000s, that was largely due to a lot of the efforts from some of the people at Fox and really making this driver stars, your Jeff Gordons and your Tony Stewarts and your Jimmy Johnsons. It all revolves around the characters, putting on the show. And I think it's a really good angle to take. I think it's a great approach, and it's just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do. As Townsend said, there's more than 3 great personalities in this series, but we're starting somewhere, and hopefully we can grow it from there.
I've spoken to Will briefly about this already, but for the two of you again, what do you think the Fox package will bring from a viewership experience, maybe for the viewership experience in race for people watching? What might be different to what we've seen in previous years?
I think just a whole lot more in terms of, I'm going to call it bells and whistles, but, let's just take drones, for instance. We'll have drones at St. Pete for the first time. Who knows what we'll get at the end of the day from that, but it should be awesome. And St. Pete in particular, if you just think about the final corner that leads onto the front straightaway, the runway there at St. Pete, for so many years, we analyze different racing lines through there. Do you kind of come in early and fire big entry speed and kind of double apex there? Do you come in with late apex, square it off to get down the straightaway? All of a sudden now we're going to have some tools to help us tell that story a lot better. I can't imagine how cool it'll be to have a drone following side-by-side action there. It's that aggressive, and James mentioned this earlier, Pam Miller and Jacob Ullman and the whole gang at Fox, they're just open to ideas and suggestions, and they're willing to try just about anything. So much so that I think I have to be a little careful now. I'm always the one throwing out, hey, I got this crazy idea. They're
yes, you do.
Doing it. They're actually doing it. And, so it's fun. They're willing to try it. And I like that aggressive, edgy approach. So I think you're going to see a lot from a graphic standpoint in terms of how things are shot. But I think it's also important to remember that for 13 years, with NBC, we worked really, really hard to get the race storytelling right, and we had to improve that year over year over year. And I don't think that's going to go away. That's really important to me as well. And I think everybody was pretty universally complimentary of how tightly we tried to stay on top of the action. So hopefully it's the best of both worlds, this kind of big new promotional push with bells and whistles and making sure we get the critical storytelling right in terms of how the race plays out.
Right, regular listeners of the podcast, you'll be aware of the Podium Predictor tournament. We get some of our friends from the podcast to predict what the podium is going to be like each weekend. Very simple, and it's on a points-paying basis. So 3 points if you get a driver on the podium spot on, 2 points if you get a driver on the podium one off, and then 1 point if they're on the podium, but they are 2 off their actual position. So we'll start off with the fans. If you didn't know, on that Instagram story on the build up to every race weekend, we will ask for your top 3 predictions, and we did that exactly this weekend. The prediction from the fans was McLaughlin, Dixon, and Lundgaard. So 3 points there for Scott Dixon. So a very decent start for the fans there. We'll move on to Tom Gaymore, who joined us on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, a very good friend of the podcast. Not a very good result for him, though, as he predicted Herta, McLaughlin, and O'Ward. That is 0 points there for Tom Gaymore. So not a great start for the defending vice champion. Also at Sky Sports is Neil Wooding, who runs the production for Sky Sports back here in the UK. His prediction was McLaughlin, O'Ward, and Palou. So that's going to be 1 point for him for predicting Álex Palou. Archie, your prediction was Scott McLaughlin, Joseph Newgarden, and Pato O'Ward. So that's 2 points for you there, with Newgarden being 1 position off. If it was up to the overtake, you would have got 3 there. So that's maybe slightly unfortunate for you on this
Screw
occasion.
the fuel. Screw the fuel. At least I'm on the board. It's a respectable start.
Decent start to the season, better than some of the people on 0. My prediction was Colton Herta, Scott McLaughlin, and Joseph Newgarden. So I bagged 3 points there for Joseph Newgarden. So that's
Screw the fuel. Screw the fuel.
No, absolutely fantastic stuff, mate. I actually predicted Dixon 4th and Palou 5th. So that's slightly infuriating. But I got McLaughlin 3rd at the very least. And we have 2 IndyCar writers joining in with us this year. First of all is Morgan, as part of the IndyCar team, who predicted Newgarden, Kirkwood, and McLaughlin. So that's 1 point there. And then we have another writer, Jackson, who predicted O'Ward, Herta, and Lundgaard for, unfortunately, 0 points. And then a very good friend, James Scott, who's obviously joined us in the last couple of weeks, predicting McLaughlin, Palou, Herta. So that's 2 points there for James to kick off the season. So I'm still in the lead. My form continues. Very early days still, but my form continues from last year. So that's absolutely great start to the season for me. Now, new for this year. 13th place is often an unlucky number. But for this tournament, it won't be unlucky. You have to predict the 13th place finisher every single week. And in true 13th place fashion, I'll actually predict Marcus Armstrong. He was nowhere near 13th all weekend. Not a great start. But it gets better for me as I predicted David Malukas to finish 13th, to go 1 for 1 to start off in the 13th place predictions competition. So I'm enthralled now. What a start to the season for me. Top podium predictor, top of 13th place, and yeah, great start. And of course, we are bringing back the Fast 6 predictor tournament as well. So me and Archie, another 1v1 competition. Archie's prediction was McLaughlin, Newgarden, Power, Herta, O'Ward, and Rosenqvist. So that's 3 there, which is pretty decent effort.
I'm happy with my Rosenqvist shout. I'm happy with the Rosenqvist shout.
Yeah. To start off the season, I went for Scott McLaughlin, Pato O'Ward, Colton Herta, Carl Kirkwood, Will Power, and Joseph Newgarden. So that is 2 for me. So you take a very, very, very early lead in the
Get in.
Fast 6 predictor tournament.
Happy with that.
And that's it for St. Petersburg. Obviously, a great way to kick off the IndyCar season. And the racing, I'm sure, will get even better from this point onwards. Obviously, Álex Palou, the Conquistador of concrete, coming out on top again. Hopefully, you enjoyed a few exclusive clips in there as well. And obviously, our predictions and everything you need to know about the Grand Prix of St. Petersburg. If you're new to the podcast, welcome along. We hope you stay tuned. Our race reviews will probably be along this course for the rest of the season. We tried to have fun as well as give you all the necessary information about every IndyCar race we can. Now, IndyCar is off for 3 weeks now, which is a bit of a shame. But of course, we are back every single week. We have been back every single week for almost 2 years now. And going forwards, I promise you, listeners, we will get back to doing Tuesdays. We've had a sketchy few weeks, but we will go back to doing Tuesdays. Obviously, last week was very busy. We obviously had Will Buxton coming on, and we had our 2024 season predictions, our 2025 season predictions, I should say, our 2025 season preview. And also, if you haven't caught it, an exclusive interview with Stingray Rob, which released last week ahead of his 2025 season. So that's worth a listen if you haven't already.
This is episode 99, by the way.
Nice. So big pressure for next week to come out with a banging episode. So, wow, I didn't realise that. So, pressure's on next week. We don't fully know what's going to happen next week yet. We'll wait and see is what we're going to tell you. This is wait and see. We've got plans, so it should be quite a good one, but we can't guarantee anything yet. But stay tuned, because we will have something, as we have done for the last 2 years, for the big one, the episode 100. Wow, that is quite emotional. But we'll save our emotions for next time. But the Conquistador of concrete is back on top again. Álex Palou wins the Grand Prix of St. Petersburg to kick off the 2025 season. And for this time, thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you